Good morning. It's been a little while since I've read. Still struggling with this cold or whatever it is, and I'm still coughing. So I'm going to try to keep that to a minimum. Today I am reading an essay called Eyes of Laura Mars, a Binocular Critique by Lucy Fischer and Marcia Landy. This is an essay from the book American Horrors, Essays on the Modern American Horror Film, edited by Gregory A. Waller. And it is obviously based on the movie Eyes of Laura Mars. So if you haven't seen that, the movie is a mystery, so this is going to give away pretty significant pieces you might want to watch before you listen to this. So I'm going to get started with a little bit of background on the authors and this essay. Much more explicitly than the first three essays in this collection, Lucy Fischer and Marcia Landy's Binocular Critique of Eyes of Laura Mars, reprinted from Screen 23, September-October 1982, is the demonstration of a critical method that utilizes insights gleaned from contemporary work in feminist, ideological, and psychoanalytic film criticism and theory. Accordingly, Fischer and Landy's focus is not simply on the representation of women in Eyes of Laura Mars, but also on this film's ideology of vision and its treatment of spectatorship. Is the self-reflexivity of this film, Fischer and Landy ask, a means of directing us toward an informed, progressive view of sexual politics? Or is it merely one more eclectic, seductive strategy that trades on the female body, violence, and aggressive vision? Given that modern horror has become increasingly self-reflexive and preoccupied with the violent victimization of women, the two alternate readings of Eyes of Laura Mars offered by Fischer and Landy have important implications for our understanding of the course the genre has taken since the late 1970s. Fischer and Landy are both professors in the film studies program at the University of Pittsburgh. Fischer's articles on film have appeared in such journals as Film Quarterly, Cinema Journal, Millennium, and Wide Angle. In addition to her recent book, Fascism and Film, The Italian Commercial Cinema, 1930 to 1943, Landy has published articles on film in New German Critique, Cinetracts, Film Criticism, Jump Cut, and other journals. That's the end of the intro. Just one sec. In recent years, the criticism on women and film has surfaced strategies for identifying the nature and presence of male-dominated vision in cinematic discourse. Psychoanalysis, in particular, has provided a method and language for reading texts and locating their patriarchal ideology. Such readings, however, have limited their scope to the text and have not taken into account the film's impact on audience or the stylistic devices through which the text is materialized. Furthermore, they do not place their analyses within a broader consideration of the film's existence as a product in the marketplace, its relationship to film traditions and genres, and its interaction with other cultural practices. To raise questions about incompleteness of such readings, we are proposing a two-part essay in which these critical issues are addressed. Part 1 offers a serious reading of a film that remains within the boundaries of the text. In particular, the reading will entertain a psychoanalytic examination of the narrative as a way of identifying the sexual politics of the film. Part 2 places that reading in dialogue with a consideration of the film's mode of production, its stylistic strategies, and its cultural allusions, and thereby tests the adequacy of the reading for deciphering the position of women. Through structuring our essay in this manner, we address the question of how to read a film so as to avoid treating it as a static, hermetic object, and rather to view it as a dynamic system in interaction with its own multiple codes and with other cultural articulations. We have chosen specifically to examine Eyes of Laura Mars, 1978, directed by Irvin Kershner, because the film openly raises certain relevant issues concerning the representation of women in film, the relationship between sexual oppression, violence, and pornography, and the role of film, television, advertising, and photography in producing and reproducing patriarchal ideology. Furthermore, Laura Mars seems to be capable of generating controversy because it can provide diametrically opposing reactions. When we recently taught the film, for example, the students in the class were divided as to whether the film was unmitigated pornography because of its unrelieved fusion of sex, aggression, and spectacle, or a subtle exposure of sexual politics, surfacing connections between female subordination and the media's exploitation of ways of seeing women. How can a film be considered by some viewers as critically progressive and by others as ideologically suspect? The answer to this question may be located in the problematics of the text, or it may reside in the critical methods brought to bear on it. This essay seeks to address these issues. Part 1. Quote, narrative does not imitate. The passion which may excite us in reading a novel is not that of a vision. Rather, it is that of meaning, that of a higher order relation which also has its emotions, its hopes, its dangers, its triumphs. End quote. Roland Barthes, Structural Analysis of Narratives. As Roland Barthes has noted in an essay on literature, one of the motivating forces that propels us through narrative is the desire to ascribe meaning to stories, to fathom their significance. Some narratives are openly resistant to such a process, subverting the reader's urge to comprehend. Others seem to invite the enterprise, conveniently providing the reader with the resident details and clues. Eyes of Laura Mars is a work in the latter category. Though on one level it presents itself as merely a transparent genre piece of the thriller horror variety, on another plane it poses as a work of some self-consciousness that seems to perform the metacritical act of commenting on its own mode of being and address. Thus, Laura Mars encourages the viewer not only to naively follow the narrative action, but also to peruse it for deeper implications. As Roland Barthes has remarked, such an interpretive process has its hopes, but also its apparent dangers. But the question arises as to why Laura Mars invites the viewer to undertake such a reading, and, furthermore, what kind of a reading it ultimately engenders. It is the very subject matter of the work that initially intimates a degree of self-reflexivity, since the film suggestively concerns a woman photographer whose associates are killed by a madman, and whose vision becomes progressively associated with that of the murderer himself. Given this emphasis on photography and sight in a voyeuristic mad slasher movie, the spectator is invited to assume a certain self-consciousness on the part of the filmmakers, and to wonder whether the work might perform an autocritique. If the viewer accepts such an invitation, what kind of a reading might he or she formulate, and what are its hopes and its dangers? To begin such an analysis, it is useful to return to the title of the film, which emphasizes the eyes of Laura Mars, her sight, her vision. This, of course, refers to her narrative status as a photographer, and also to her role as a psychic seer of the murderer's villainous acts. Furthermore, throughout the film, her look is stressed through an optical eye, iconography of close-ups of her eyeballs, poised in gaping horror. But beyond the issue of her literal sight lies the more intriguing question of her vision as a photographer. What kind of a vision is it, and what are its implications within the narrative discourse? Laura Mars is a high-fashion photographer whose work has an original cast to it. Her poses involve mostly female models in postures of stylized violence. In many of the pictures, they seem to be victims. In one, a woman in garters lies draped across a bed, as though she had been murdered. In other photographs, the models seem disturbingly aggressive, as in the image of a woman holding a gun over a dead man in a pool. In yet other pictures, the women seem engaged in a lesbian struggle. In a sequence Laura shoots at Columbus Circle, Two models in underwear and fur coats enact a hair-pulling, girly fight while posed against the background of a burning car. The sadomasochistic thrust of her photography is clear, with women placed either in the role of mutilated victims or Amazonian assailants. In both situations, women's bodies are fetishized and the connection made between female sexuality and violence. Clearly, we recognize the images created by Laura Mars in an iconography oppressive to women, a vision that is decidedly patriarchal. Whether her models are portrayed as passive objects of brutality or perpetrators of violence themselves, they function not as females, but as the sign of male sexual fears. In their aggressive postures, they enact a threat to man, and in their stance as victims, they are punished for it. In this respect, the high-fashion photography of Laura Mars shares much with the mise-en-scène of pornography, which, as critics have noted, shapes female sexuality in the image of male sexual fantasies. Thus, Laura Mars has what we might term male vision, a way of seeing that reflects the dominant sexist ideology. Perhaps that is why the decor of her apartment favors mirrors that constantly barrage her with the sight of the female image. Within this context, even her name seems filled with significance, as since Mars was a Roman war god, and his astrological sign has been used as a symbol of masculinity. Even the narrative action of the film raises this issue quite explicitly, when a reporter at Laura's gallery opening asks her to respond to charges that her work is offensive to women. In the sense we have used the term thus far, male vision has been meant metaphorically, to suggest that Laura sees like a man. But what is interesting about the film is that it articulates this notion on a literal level. Whereas Laura tells us that years ago she saw artistic flashes of violence that inspired her work, now she experiences literal visions in which she sees through the eyes of a male killer. What is intriguing about this narrative configuration is not Laura's status as a psychic, which seems a mere narrative ploy. Rather, what stands out is the connection implied between Laura's work as a photographer and the act of homicide, her artistic vision, and the murderer's point of view. Significantly, the victims are all associated with Laura or her work and include her editor, her models, her manager, and her husband. Furthermore, her moments of second sight are linked to her photographic practice. After her first episode, which comes as a kind of nightmare, she immediately goes to her light box and examines a series of pictures while playing nervously with a pair of scissors. At another point, a psychic vision hits her while she is developing prints, and then while she is in the middle of a photographic session. Even the dialogue seems to emphasize the ties between her photographic enterprise and murder. "Kill the shoot!" her manager, Donald, screams, as Laura finds herself unable to continue work. Finally, when she is brought to the police station for questioning about the murders, a detective, John Neville, points out the parallels between her fashion compositions and unpublished crime snapshots. Thus, through its particular choice of narrative actions, the film literalizes the notion of Laura's male vision. Her work is not only influenced by a patriarchal point of view, but also her sight is literally taken over by that of a man. At the moments of her psychic inspiration, her own female vision is blinded, and she stumbles around her environment, bumping into walls. In this respect, the film seems to operate as a kind of cautionary tale for the male-oriented woman who, in adopting patriarchal attitudes, cannot fail but to oppress her own sex, to engage symbolically in their murder. By the end of the film, Laura has even taken in hand the killer's gun, an object she has consistently refused to recognize as an extension of her photographic lens. Laura's confusion regarding gender identification seems encapsulated in a particular image of her manager, Donald, who dresses up in her clothes one night to help her throw police bodyguards off her trail. There is yet another aspect of the narrative and stylistic construction of Laura Mars that makes it suggestive as a discourse on male-female vision, and it has to do with the moments in which Laura herself is pursued. At these times, since she sees through the eyes of the killer, she views herself in the third person, from behind, stalked from some hidden vantage point. The first such occurrence takes place in her dockside studio, when the killer chases her down a hall. As she runs into Donald's arms for safety, she cries, "I saw him looking at me." The final instance of this trope occurs at the end of the film, when the killer is revealed to be the policeman, John Neville. Again, what is provocative about this narrative stylistic device is the way it can be read to literalize an issue in the ideology of vision. In an often quoted section of Ways of Seeing, John Berger states, quote, "Men act and women appear. Men look at women. Women watch themselves being looked at. The surveyor of woman in herself is male, the surveyed female. Thus she turns herself into an object, and most particularly an object of vision, a sight." End quote. It is precisely this split consciousness of the male-oriented woman that is dramatized in the vision of Laura Mars. When her sight is dominated by the killer, she literally sees herself as an object, and her consciousness functions both as the surveyor and the surveyed. Within the narrative, this can be read as the logical extension of her photographic work, in which she generates images of women designed to satisfy the male gaze. Even the fact that Laura is symbolically punished for her work seems contained within a patriarchal ideology. In the same text, Berger talks of how female nude models were often posed holding a mirror. He remarks, "You painted a naked woman because you enjoyed looking at her. You put a mirror in her hand and you called the painting vanity, thus morally condemning the woman whose nakedness you had depicted for your own pleasure." In Laura Mars, of course, the mirror has been augmented by a camera, but she too stands chastised for treating women as men have trained her, and as an object of sight. There is a final way in which the film literalizes certain notions concerning male vision, and, in this regard, has particular relevance to film. In her article, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, Laura Mulvey discusses how dramatic movies are structured according to the male gaze. Through this figure of a central hero, the audience is led to identify with a masculine perspective. As she writes, quote, "The male protagonist is free to command the stage, a stage of spatial illusions in which he articulates the look and creates the action." End quote. Thus, though women may be present in the film, it is the male characters, and by extension the male audience, who are the active controllers of the look, and who therefore dominate the narrative trajectory. Though in most classical films this dynamic is masked by codes of seamless editing, in Laura Mars the control of the male gaze is brought to the surface as part of the actual plot. In an article on Myths of Women in the Cinema, Claire Johnston terms women the pseudo-center of the filmic discourse because they function only as signs of male consciousness. Again, in Laura Mars, this concept is literalized in the figure of a photographer whose mind and body seem almost inhabited by a male double. While emphasizing male vision, the film also seems to enact a prohibition against female vision, another feature of sexist ideology. While man is traditionally posited as the ideal spectator, and women positioned as the object of his surveillance, she is never accorded an equal scopic stance. Rather, her vision must be entirely muted and passive, and she must never actively return the look. Again, the plot of Laura Mars articulates this repression. In the beginning of the film, Laura instructs her male beauticians to highlight the model's eyes to make them pop out. But once the murderer begins stabbing his victim's eyes, she instructs her makeup artists to tone them down, to hide them with waves of hair. Thus, within the film, women are symbolically warned against looking, and their vision regarded as a clear and present threat to man. It is as though the female look had the power to arouse some deep-seated male anxiety and to trigger some violent retaliatory response. In this regard, one thinks of the shocking image of the eye being slashed in Louis Buñuel's Un Chien Andalou, and of Jean Vigo's critical question, when we flinch from the screen image of a woman's eye sliced in half by a razor, is it more dreadful than the spectacle of a cloud veiling a full moon? But on what is this apparent dread of woman based? And moreover, what is its relevance to Eyes of Laura Mars? Once again, it is the very narrative of the film that invites us to examine the issue. For when the identity of the murderer is revealed, the killer is portrayed as a psychopath who offers us a tendentious monologue to explain the roots of his crime. Neville stands there before Laura and begins talking in the third person, as though the biography he recounts pertains to Laura's chauffeur, Tommy, on whom he is trying to pin the heinous deeds. He talks of how his mother was a hysterical woman, a hooker, who left him in dirty diapers for days at a time while she sold her ass in the streets of the nation's capital. Laura interrupts on several occasions, bewildered, objecting. No, that's not Tommy's story. Gradually, Neville's monologue shifts to the first person as he tells her how one day a man, who may have been the child's father, appeared and slit the prostitute's throat as punishment for her maternal negligence. Neville goes on, I sat there and watched the blood dry on her face until it was just about the color of your hair. Neville, you said I, Laura gasps. This confusion in person continues later on as Neville puts a gun in Laura's hands and in a gesture of suicide tries to force her to shoot him. He tells her, if you love me, kill him. Other narrative stylistic details of this sequence seem loaded with significance and encourage the spectator's decoding. For example, the final confrontation scene takes place against a background of mirrors, with Neville's and Laura's reflections frequently divided into a triptych. And at the crucial moment when Neville finally breaks down, he takes his ice pick and stabs his reflection 3 times in the eye. This smorgasbord of Freudian symbolism is difficult for the viewer of healthy semantic appetite to resist. Unlike the end of Psycho, where a psychiatric examination is offered dryly as a kind of closing convention, in Laura Mars, the scene addresses the audience with high drama and pathos and solicits their complicity. But what does the scene mean? And can it be read to display any intelligence on the part of the filmmakers concerning psychosexual dynamics? On a certain level it can, for what the scene tends to dramatize is the classical male fear of women as linked to the maternal figure. Furthermore, it posits that fear as a pathology and views it as the potential cause of violence towards women. In an insightful article on pornography, Susan Lurie sees male brutality towards women, be it physical or symbolic, as an exorcism of infantile castration fears. As she writes, the torture, rape, mutilation of women reverses the death threat associated with the castration men fear from women. But wherein does this danger lie? In her explanation of this phenomenon, Lurie differs somewhat from Freud. Whereas he seeks male anxieties as stemming from the perception of the female lack, her disturbing absence of a penis, Lurie sees male fears as derived from a sense of what females possess, of their power. While desiring bodily and spiritual reunion with the mother, the male child suspects that this will mean castration. As Lurie remarks, quote, he fantasizes that union with mother is to be what she is, not what he is. That is, he fantasizes that this union is one in which mother's superior will presides to so great an extent that he is formed in her likeness. And while this seems to have been a satisfactory, indeed delightful arrangement during infancy, his present individual sexual self, symbolized in his penis, clearly could not survive such an arrangement." End quote. Thus, Lurie emphasizes the notion of female power rather than that of female lack. She sees the man's view of woman as castrated, as arising only as a second-order configuration, and not the primary source of his fear. As she states, quote, "The concept of the mutilated creature is a wish-fulfillment fantasy intended to combat the early imagined dread of what his mother's intentional power might have in store for him." End quote. Lurie also implicitly critiques Freud's notion of identifying the threat of castration with the father. Rather, she sees the male fear as tied to anxieties regarding the maternal force. Clearly, as Neville recounts his autobiographical history in Laura Mars, many elements of Lurie's analysis of male-female psychodynamics are present. His infantile fear of the mother and her prostitute's sexual powers have obviously been transformed into hostility, and in his image of her slit throat, we see a version of Lurie's fantasy of the mutilated creature, or what Mulvey has elsewhere termed the bearer of the bleeding wound. Finally, in Neville's forcing the gun into Laura's reluctant hand and squeezing the trigger into his belly, we find dramatized the male fear of woman as appropriator of the phallus through some violent destructive act. Given this context, it comes as no surprise when Neville ultimately stabs himself in the eye, as though a symbolic punishment for viewing his mother as object of dread and desire. As various feminist critics have pointed out, the sexual implications of a man robbed of his sight go far beyond the Oedipal tale. In a different Greek myth, the seer, Tiresias, is blinded by Hera after he has declared female sexuality more pleasurable than male. And in another legend, Peeping Tom is blinded for looking at the nude body of Lady Godiva. Neville's confession also hints at Oedipal conflicts, though, contrary to Freud, it casts the father more in the role as savior than aggressor. Still, the Oedipal triangle seems clearly implied in the plethora of triadic mirror images that flood the final sequences. Furthermore, Laura is portrayed in the closing sections of the film in a maternal stance, at one point wearing a Madonna-like scarf. Even her characterization as psychically potent can be seen as a transposition of the notion of mother as a magical force. Finally, as Neville's monologue veers toward incomprehensibility, he speaks to Laura as though he had a rival for her affections. "I don't know what you see in this guy," he complains incoherently. "I'm the one you want." His persona in this speech, which shifts fluidly among that of his father, his mother, and Laura, parallels his earlier split between first and third person, as though he were the psychic battlefield for some struggle of identity and identification. What this discussion of Laura Mars has sought to demonstrate is the kind of reading that the film readily occasions. It presents itself to the viewer as more than a simple thriller or horror movie, or story of crime and its resolution. Rather, its dense and elusive surface proposes it as a veritable discourse on the issues of violence toward women and the psychosexual dynamics of sight. It does so by suggestively taking as its subject the figure of a photographer, one who exploits women in her work. Then, quite fittingly, it casts the photographer as possessed by the vision of a deranged male sex killer, whose homicidal point of view becomes identified with her art. The film even hints at the roots of such misogyny in its characterization of the murderer as a psychopath whose savage acts are clearly compensatory for his fear of women. The film then goes on to associate his hatred of females with the dynamics of vision, with the dread of viewing the castrated female body, and the voyeuristic pleasure of seeing women sexually abused. Moreover, through its choice of the killer's particular crime, the film alludes to man's horror of the woman, who reverses the dynamics of vision, who dares to look back. Read in this fashion, Eyes of Laura Mars appears to document a psychosexual problem that afflicts the cinema as a scopic medium, and especially the sensational horror thriller genre. To borrow Roland Barthes' language from the opening quote, we might say that such an interpretation can at least raise such hopes for the text. But following Barthes' line of thought a bit further, we might question whether such a generous exegesis is truly exhaustive, or whether it might mask certain critical dangers. It is for this reason that we have chosen not to take just a monocular view of Eyes of Laura Mars, but rather to see it in dual focus as a gesture of binocular critical vision. Part 2. Quote, during the last few years, an overlay of erstwhile mythic significance has become a valuable selling tool, or so many producers and directors think, and the result has been that a number of very small films have been invested with a grandiose importance, the weight of which they can hardly bear. Irvin Kershner's Eyes of Laura Mars is a perfect example of this ploy. At the center of the film is a very short, rather silly plot upon which is hung great gobs of would-be significance. Semioticians speak of a sign of communication composed of two equal halves, the signifier and the signified. A film like Laura Mars is all signifiers that never connect with the signifieds, or to put it more poetically, full of sound and fury. End quote. James Monaco, American Film Now. It is interesting that James Monaco singles out Laura Mars to exemplify the banality and seductiveness of many contemporary Hollywood films. Apparently he selects it because it is a film capable of generating misreadings. Yet the film deserves more than Monaco's hasty dismissal. As the discussion above has shown, the film does connect to its signifiers and signifieds. The problem is not, as Monaco indicates, that the film says nothing, but that it says everything. This section will examine Laura Mars as an eclectic film that, in its eclecticism, subverts its own ostensible intentions. Our previous discussion reveals how the film documents the classic paradigm of female oppression. But if we place that reading within the dynamics of a larger filmic discourse, the question arises as to whether Laura Mars exposes the phenomenon of male-dominated vision and the cultural hostility toward women, or merely exploits its audience in the name of these issues, or does both at the same time. A second analysis of the film is therefore necessary. Laura Mars belongs to the Hollywood new wave of films identified with independent producers, featuring prestigious directors such as Francis Ford Coppola, John Frankenheimer, Arthur Penn, Martin Scorsese, Woody Allen, and others. This generation of producers and directors is reputed to have a larger measure of control over their works in contrast to the forms of production characteristic of the old studio system. Great involvement in financing has enabled directors to have more influence over subject matter and treatment of films, enabling them to entertain a broad array of issues in ostensibly more direct fashion. The 1968 lifting of the censorship code and the institution of a rating system in the United States have further encouraged the representation of formerly taboo subjects as divorce, adultery, sexual relations, social deviance, and violence in more explicit ways. Yet a closer examination of the economic structures governing these films exposes the illusory nature of independent production, most particularly the tendency toward conglomeration in the 1970s that has made the movie industry more dependent than ever on immediate and large-scale profits, and especially on the control of outside investors. The nature of conglomeration is such that the production of a film is only one aspect of a network of merged but diversified industries. For example, Monaco describes how MCA, one of the first film conglomerates, to take shape, owns several record companies, Spencer gift stores, a train manufacturer, a savings and loan association in Colorado, a computer service company, and 3 publishers, G.P. Putnam's Sons, Coward, McCann, and Geohegan and Berkeley, as well as New Times Magazine. The effects of conglomeration have been mixed. Studios in danger of disappearance have been salvaged by the new system. The new corporation men, according to Michael Pye and Linda Miles, lacked the technical knowledge that most... Hold on a second. The new corporational... The new corporation men, according to Michael Pye and Linda Miles, quote, lacked the technical knowledge that past producers shared. Their ignorance now distances them from the filmmakers, but it also makes them dependent on the filmmakers, on being offered ideas from directors, writers, and producers who are younger, who know the art and craft of film, and who know a world outside the studio machine and have some instinctive sympathy with the new cine-literate generation that comprises the majority of film audiences, end quote. But as Monaco has also suggested, today, film has become more of a business than an industry with an emphasis on profit first, the product second. The product can be as disparate as film and insurance, records and sugarcane. And loss in one area can be compensated for in another. However, the commitment to film is considerably lessened under this system of financing and management. Changes in Hollywood modes of production can be documented in the diminished number of films produced, and the consequent emphasis on creating blockbusters, and the high-powered advertising strategies developed for ferreting out audience response, in particular, the use of consumer research methods similar to the hard sell tactics in other areas of advertising, in the influx of outsiders into the film industry from television, and in the incorporation of eclectic strategies within the films for attracting the broadest possible audiences. Thus, the process of economic diversification is paralleled in the forms and treatments of these films that draw in different strata of the public. Laura Mars, for example, makes an attempt to appeal simultaneously to intellectuals, pop culture fans, horror film buffs, film aesthetes, high fashion consumers, viewers of pornography, and the budding moral majority. The film also tries to make contact with the earlier genre film production, altering it to suit contemporary audiences. The thriller horror film, in particular, continues to enjoy a rebirth, though it incorporates more sophisticated strategies to suit its urbane audiences. As with other genre films that continue to be produced, the use of self-reflexive techniques, psychoanalysis, allusions to political events or movements, a capitalizing on social decadence, and a foregrounding and use of high technology and other media characterize the eclecticism of Laura Mars in its treatment of genre. This eclecticism applies to the film's style, system of references, narrative strategies, and also to its point of view, which seems at the same time straightforward and parodic. Above all, an analysis of many of these films of the 1970s and 1980s reveals them to be especially self-conscious in their strategies for wooing spectators, poised, as one critic has suggested, between mockery and indulgence of the audience. It would seem, therefore, that a fruitful method for interrogating the ideology of these films would reside in an analysis of their uses of the means and ends of self-reflexivity and spectatorship, particularly as these interact with the mode of production described above. The soundtrack of Laura Mars is heavily dependent on pop music. From the first moment of the film to its conclusion, the lyrics and music serve to identify the film's connection to the world of commercialized pop culture. The introductory and concluding song, in particular, performed by a woman, emphasizing imprisonment, psychic pain, and oniric experience, merges with the film's situating of the woman as the focus of vision and of verbal aggression and physical assault. But the music, independent of the narrative, also fuses with the other uses of media in the film to create an autonomous and gratuitous experience for the audience, akin to the self-absorption associated with listening to pop music. The audience can appreciate the music in and of itself, independent of its role in developing the film's thematics. For example, during the scene of the models dressing for a photographic session, a song is heavily overlaid on the soundtrack, turning the sequence into a disco number. Furthermore, the songs Let's All Chant and The Eyes of Laura Mars, sung by Barbra Streisand, were released well in advance of the film, the former song having occupied a place for a time among the top 10 list of hits. Thus, the film was able to tap other resources for arousing audience expectations, as well as to capitalize on other avenues of profit. At the same time that the film woos its pop culture constituency, it also appeals to intellectuals. For example, early in the film, in a shot of one of the victims' apartments, we see books on Talleyrand and Russia and one by Studs Terkel, which provide further clues to the film's eclecticism. The intellectual allusions are thus fused with the pop culture elements, thereby inviting a diverse audience to view the film. The foregrounding of the book, Eyes of Laura Mars, identified with the film's title, connects the subject matter and the style of the book to the film, indicating the circularity and self-enclosed nature of the filmic text that is in dialogue with itself. Laura Mars's attempt at self-reflexivity can be further documented in the film's absorption of still other media. Beyond the uses of pop music, books, and photography, the film calls attention to television technology, newscasting, newspaper reporting, celebrity interviewing, and high-fashion modeling. Moreover, the playing with onstage, backstage, and offstage settings in the sequences involving costuming, makeup, directing, and photographing, as well as in the casual scenes at home, acts to suppress differences between performance and life, to fuse media spectacle and private experience. The question raised throughout the film, exemplified particularly in the comments of the newscaster at the exhibition of Laura Mars's work, is, what is the connection between media practices, sexual exploitation, violence, and profit-making? In his words, is this all a hype? A woman reporter asserts that the photographs of nude and semi-clothed women are offensive to women, and one of the models comments that the world you see is violent, and that the photographs merely mirror that violence for the spectator. Thus, Laura Mars, in its self-reflective gargantuanism, even anticipates and co-opts the potential responses of the external audience. The element of spectatorship linked to the film's self-referential ploys also reveals a self-conscious taxonomic treatment of ways seeing, but, like the reiterative use of the split mirrors replicating the image of Laura Mars, the ostensibly different forms of looking merge to reproduce one form of gaze, namely, of aggressive and voyeuristic spectatorship. The first image of the film confronts the external viewer with the close-up image of an eye. A long take forces prolonged viewing of a positive image of Laura Mars, which is transformed into a negative image. These shots are repeated as the film's conclusion. The particular object of focus that the audience confronts, the object of mutilation, is the right eye, and the instrument of attack is an ice pick. The violence that the spectator is forced to observe is therefore associated with vision, and particularly with the monocular vision of the camera eye. Though the murderer is not a photographer, his act of vengeance is merged with the photographer's vision. One scene in the film particularly dramatizes this dynamic. When Laura tries to explain to Neville the nature of her second sight, she uses the video cameras and monitors for her demonstration. Furthermore, the external spectator's gaze is identified with the killer's and with the camera eye. The spectator is positioned in the empty space behind the moving camera, which approaches the victim. In these shots, particularly the identification of the audience with the psychotic and violent criminal is unambiguous. The voyeurism of which Laura is accused by Neville when he first meets her is thus attributed to the external audience as it occupies a privileged space in the scrutiny of mutilation. Aggressive spectatorship is not limited to the male solely, but is also attributed to women in the film. Laura, as photographer, and particularly as photographer of female victims, shares with the killer a complicit look at the violent destruction of other females. Not only does the film, therefore, reinforce the connection among photography, violence, and the victimization of women, but also it implicates both sexes in the process. Moreover, the film's self-referentiality serves also to implicate the film itself in reproducing these connections. Laura Mars also identifies other spectators. For example, when Laura arrives at the gallery, the camera focuses on the street crowd of celebrity seekers who observe her as she emerges from the car. She is subject to the same scrutiny as her models. Her physical appearance is calculated to arouse sexual curiosity. Though her torso is completely covered, a shot of the lower part of her body reveals a deep slit in her skirt as the camera focuses in close-up on her exposed thigh and leg. She wears a similar costume in the scenes where she photographs models on the street, and again, the camera focuses on her exposed legs. During the photographing session, still more spectators are identified. Tommy, the chauffeur, a prime murder suspect, is portrayed suspiciously as a voyeur. Laura's view of the models through the lens is shared with the audience as the scene shows the women fighting with one another and the image of a burning car. The sequence also captures passers-by on the street who become part of the film. While obviously not scripted, they nonetheless assume a role in the film's incorporation of different spectators. The orchestration of male and female, fictional and real spectators, threatening and random surveillance are concentric, all leading to the same object of regard, the focus on the female and on scenes of violence, creating a bond of complicity between the internal and external spectators to the film. The dual structure of narrative and self-referentiality work, therefore, to blur rather than distinguish between filmic and actual events. The reflexivity not only assimilates the audience into the narrative, but also creates a sense in which the audience is implicated vicariously or actively in the act of looking and at the end of experiencing a world where there is no escape from media manipulation, psychopathology, and aggression. Like the thriller horror film to which it is related, Laura Mars attempts to exploit a highly stylized and choreographed use of the camera and editing to unsettle and involve the viewer. The positioning of the victims under surveillance and attack is predictable. They are shown in undefended, vulnerable positions, cornered and unable to escape. The audience, however, does not occupy their position, but remains in the aggressive position of the voyeur and demented killer. Unlike Michael Powers' Peeping Tom, 1960, where the audience shares the places of aggressor and victim, the spectator in Laura Mars is rarely, if at all, in the position of the victims. Moreover, in Peeping Tom, we are aware from the outset of the killer's identity, whereas Laura Mars adds, among its other affect-arousing strategies, elements of suspense and uncertainty, suggesting further that Kirshner is less interested in analysis of the killer's psychopathology than in the generating of audience involvement. With the exception of the scenes following the death of two of Laura's models, where Laura and John are walking in the woods, and the following scenes where they make love, the film does not provide any safe or tranquil vantage points, any alternative vision of an outlet from the urban media nightmare. Alone in their homes, women are shown, as in the classic thriller horror film, as potential targets of male aggression and murder. Furthermore, in Tommy's apartment house, as he ascends to meet Neville, the sounds of marital discord and squabbles over money can be heard in the hall, further contributing to the film's atmosphere of antagonism and discord. If Laura Mars is contrasted with Peeping Tom, a film that is also self-reflexive, involving filmmaking and the equation between spectatorship and aggression, the sexual problematics of Kirshner's film can be identified more clearly. In Peeping Tom, Powell uses the self-referential elements to distance rather than implicate the audience. Also, the acts of looking and violence are concentrated in the male, whose erotic desire is sublimated in the camera eye. The film does not fetishize the female body, nor highlight gratuitous scenes of sexual deviance. The killer is identified specifically with his father, the person responsible for warping the son's vision, and the son, in his desire to fuse with the dreaded father, enacts the crime of killing the mother. Thus the father, not the mother, is the source of conflict. The psychological emphasis in Laura Mars, on the other hand, is disappointment with the mother. The explanation for Neville's aggression, reserved for the final moments of the film, is over-identification with and revenge against the mother. Throughout the film, the portrayals of men reveal the men to be weak and impotent, and their weakness seems traceable to fantasies of female dominance. One of the policemen comments that the city is full of creeps. Donald, a homosexual, is a victim of the killer's assault. Tommy is an ex-criminal and a voyeur. A gratuitous image of a male dwarf appears early in the film. The police are presented as unsympathetic, lecherous, and trigger-happy, and the murderer himself is a policeman. Michael, Laura's former husband, presents himself as a total failure and an exploiter of women. His impotence and rage against females is most clearly demonstrated in his accusations that Laura's career is to blame for his writer's block. That Laura Mars's photography corresponds to the police photographs provides further evidence of the film's reductive treatment of the relationship between art and society, which sees art merely as a reflection of social decadence, the mirror replication of sexuality and violence without mediation. The film invites the audience to confirm the notion that individuals and institutions are the creation of a sick society, suffering from the absence of family stability and proper male and female roles. Furthermore, the film's fusion of male and female vision does not lead toward a critique of phallocentrism, but in an opposite direction, toward an attack on shifting sexual relations identified as a major source of pathology. The male killer and the female photographer proclaim themselves to be old-fashioned and moral, and both are presented as stunted by their perverse environment in their capacity for a natural life. Thus, in the final analysis, the film veers toward nostalgia and traditional sexual attitudes. In effect, Laura Mars's costume provides a clue to the film's operation. Like the severe, old-fashioned outfits she wears, the film maintains a conventional moral view, but it has an ideological slit that invites prurience and undercuts this point of view. In this way, Laura Mars sustains diverse and contradictory attitudes. Finally, it is in the film's eclecticism that it most reveals the way it produces ideology. Not only does an analysis of the content confirm the reproduction of familiar sexual attitudes, but also an analysis of the form, the film's system of references, and especially its treatment of audience, reveals the film's cynicism and its complicity with exploitative modes for generating cinematic involvement. In spite of the film's uses of self-reflexivity, the distancing devices associated with such a practice are absent, and the treatment of spectatorship seems to corroborate that the film reproduces the ways of seeing it purports to question, specifically in its exploitation of voyeurism towards the ends of profit. The film's treatment of ostensibly different modes of spectatorship have culminated in a familiar gaze, the gaze that fixes on the helpless victims, independent females, homosexuals, or social deviants, all figures of marginality. The film's concern with marginality functions in the now familiar ideological terrain where society is viewed as being threatened by socially aberrant behavior. The film points an accusing figure at these social misfits as the products and producers of conflict and commercial exploitation. Capitalizing on pop music, on the glamour and increasing prestige of high-fashion photography, the screen presence of a star like Faye Dunaway, and the appeals of high and low culture commodities, Laura Mars combines hard sell advertising techniques with traditional content. Moreover, not only is the audience asked to experience the threat of an unstable world, but it is also coerced to share the responsibility for that world, even to view itself as the producer of the images it consumes. Thus, it would seem that the film's combination of self-referentiality and studied spectatorship, its inclusion of the issues of homosexuality, psychopathology, and abuse of women, are mere strategies for seducing the broadest possible audience by means of the most diverse techniques. In the final analysis, this diversity is transformed into the unitary objective of profit-making, and the medium of exchange is, as always, the female body, violence, and aggressive vision. That is the end of that chapter. The next chapter, the next essay, is Returning the Look, Eyes of a Stranger by Robin Wood. So there is this is a rather short essay, but The Eyes of a Stranger is the film. So watch it if you haven't seen it.